I told my religious studies advisor that I wanted to study abroad, she didn't know how the process for that worked. She told me that I was the first student to have asked her about that. This is interesting considering that religious studies is a field that is known for doing a lot of travel. Every religious studies professor I've ever had has given anecdotes about travel, whether it be visiting Istanbul or Mongolia or, you know, so and so. It's a big part of it. You know, a lot of YouTube channels that focus on religious studies, you will hear them talk about how at this moment they're in Cairo or, you know, various places that are relevant to their research. And also because to see religious diversity and to reframe how someone thinks about religion, going to another place is probably pretty important for that. And it's not like advisors don't help with this. I mean, I'm a double major. My other major is East Asian Studies. That advisor has definitely done a lot to help students with this process because area studies, the connection is very obvious. In fact, you actually get benefits for studying abroad that take off some of the requirements. So, anyway, a year later, I flew to Chiba because my decision was to study abroad in Japan for several reasons. One was just that my main focus is on East Asian Buddhism, and so I had been studying Japanese because a lot of times you find that the research that you're reading doesn't have much works. A lot of citations are not available in English. Japanese has a lot of academic work in it, and some of the most prestigious on Buddhist studies. So I had been studying it for a while, and I had even started debating going to graduate school there because in the United States, compared to Japan, there's a lot less options. So I had decided that I might as well try doing graduate school in Japan. But as you know, one of my professors noted, he regretted that when he did graduate school in Japan that he didn't first go there as an undergrad. It was a very difficult transition when you're used to, you know, like the way that things are done in your own country. And so one of my big goals was, you know, just to get a sense of how schooling is different in Japan and see if I even want to do graduate school there. You know, secondly, I wanted to immerse in the language. Most of my abilities were centered around reading and writing because originally I was just interested in reading papers. And I found that oftentimes conversing was really hard in my Japanese classes. Like, I knew how to, like, a lot of words in kanji that I didn't know how to pronounce because I was used to them in, you know, like, writing. And when I was in Japan, I made some weird mistakes, like using Buddhist technical terms instead of, like, the more mundane, everyday words because of the type of Japanese I was interacting with. And, you know, thirdly, and this is what this video is actually about, I wanted to experience Japanese religion in ways that I couldn't in the United States. And that third goal, which again is what this documentary is about, is really big here. I want to focus on two things. Firstly, the benefits to study abroad for a religious studies student. And secondly, I want to focus on how my views of Japanese religion changed over time. Now, before I get into that, I guess I'm going to do a kind of sponsorship. So, studying abroad is really expensive. I had no assistance from my parents. I'm a Pell Grant student, and I'm also a non-traditional student. I actually started school when I was over 25 because I'm not well off. And it was actually through scholarships that I was able to pay off a lot of what I did. And this video is actually being done because 2 scholarships conditionally required that I did a project when I came back. I decided I wanted to do a documentary, and I've already explained what that's about. Now, these 2 scholarships, which I will give links below, were very helpful. So, firstly, there's the Gilman International Scholarship Program, and secondly, there's Freeman Asia. These are both scholarships for students of financial need who can demonstrate that studying abroad will meaningfully impact their future potential in various ways. Again, I heavily recommend it. Like, I got thousands of dollars out of them, and they didn't even go directly to my bursar bill. They actually went to my bank account. So I was able to, buy my plane ticket and, food and travel expenses within Japan. And that would not have been possible without this. In fact, it would have been very hard for me to have studied abroad without these two scholarships. And so I heavily recommend to anyone who is interested in studying abroad, especially if you are financially in need, to apply for these scholarships if you are eligible. So I started university when I was 25. And as a result of that, I already knew a decent amount about, religion. I've actually read a lot of books on, Buddhism, Japanese religion, and stuff like that. And not even just those books that are designed for converts, but very academic ones. And so a lot of the benefits that I got were not the type of thing that would be the sort of shock and awe that a 18-year-old who had picked what they want to study somewhat arbitrarily gets. A lot of this was more subtle. And I want to explain my background a bit so that you can kind of appreciate that even with a decent amount of knowledge, there are a lot of benefits. So I was raised Buddhist, and my parents were very much into the beatniks, who were basically sort of the countercultural, hippie adjacent, poet group that, liked bohemian lifestyle and stuff like that. And a lot of them were very interested in Zen Buddhism. And granted, a lot of them misunderstood it. Like, for instance, my dad really likes Kerouac, who has been criticized a lot for misrepresenting Buddhism. But nonetheless, his association with, American Zen is pretty big. The book Dharma Bums, which you may have heard of if you know much about, that history, was tied to Kerouac. And so this context was sort of what I grew up with. I have always believed in the, transmigration of souls, or, rebirth, depending on what you're going to call it. Most Buddhists will probably object to using the word soul in that context. But since I was young, I had a lot of Buddhist beliefs. My parents didn't really push it on me, but I was also exposed to it a lot. There were several TV shows I watched as a kid that were very influenced by Buddhism that, my parents probably liked, because of that. Kung Fu is, one example of that, even though in many ways it often feels more Taoist than Buddhist, but, that being said, I kind of grew up with this in the background. And when I became an adult, I had a really rough period. I actually had a brief, 6-month period of homelessness where I guess I had a religious ecstasy experience when meditating, dealing with the difficulties of that. And it made me far more interested in Buddhism after that. And so I started going to libraries, reading all these books on it, trying to get a better sense of it than just sort of what was in the background at the time. And I came across this book called Buddhism and Science, A Guide for the Perplexed by Donald Lopez. And that book kind of made me reevaluate how I was thinking about Buddhism, because what I expected originally to be a book explaining how, Buddhism is compatible with science and yada yada, it was actually explaining why people believe that. And sort of about the parts of Buddhism that are incompatible with science, and the way that Buddhism, in a sort of strategy against colonialism and the Christianization of Asia by European colonial powers, was able to appeal to a type of demographic that was critical of Christianity by emphasizing science and disregarding a lot of things that were not as liked by those sort of Enlightenment style thinkers. And so this sort of post-colonial take on like Buddhist modernism, made me really interested in the sociological aspects of religion more than just, hey, what does this religion believe? What does this religion believe? As it gave me a better appreciation of the way that religion changes over time and adapts to hardship. So a few years later, I finally am in a position where going to university seems like something I can afford. So, and at that point, I have already been studying Japanese a bit because I, found that oftentimes when you're wanting to, learn stuff about Buddhism from that more academic perspective, a lot of the sources are in Japanese and hard to read. And so I basically started thinking about how if I'm wanting to learn Japanese to a point that I can read that type of academic stuff, I might as well, look into doing grad school in Japan, where there's probably more available options than in the United States. And yeah, that is the context where, I am coming into, Japan to deepen my religious studies understanding. And what I learned was subtle, like very subtle. But that subtlety was also very profound. So on August 29th, 2024, I arrived in Japan through Chiba's Narita airport. And despite what a friend of mine warned me about who had studied in China, it seems like people there actually were interested in immersing with the culture. I had some conversations with, other study abroad students in Japanese when I got there. And while I was the only religious studies student, and not many people there were very interested in religion, I had my first sort of like new information about Japanese religion very, very quick. I didn't even have to leave the airport. See, there were still some people who had adjacent interests. So, several people were into history. Some people are just really into like mythology and, like anime or video games reference it a lot. I keep getting recommended stuff because it's like, oh, this, Persona or Shin Megami Tensei or whatever, Fate has, all these references to religion, you'd appreciate it. And it's one of those things I probably should actually get into at some point. But, yeah, so there was like a konbini, like a convenience store inside of the airport. And someone who I'd met there bought a thing called inari. Now, that was interesting to me because inari is a fox goddess in Japan. And so it was, interesting to me that this food is called inari. And I asked about that, and actually this person happened to know. It was apparently the preferred food offering to her, which I didn't know that. The idea that it was named after the goddess you give it to was interesting. And it actually became one of my favorite snacks in Japan. It was really good. It's like sort of this rice that's seasoned, and then they put around the skin of tofu that comes in the process of making soy milk. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but it's really good. And yeah, that was interesting. I had never really thought too much about the process of what is offered at a Shinto shrine before, because a lot of my sort of interactions, one, I'm mostly focused on Buddhism, but also I'm usually thinking about things from more philosophical perspectives and historical, sociological dimensions. I'm not thinking too much about what type of food would you offer. It's not really a thing I think about. I did know some people who practiced the Yoruba religion, and that's a really big deal to them, but generally I had never really questioned this. And so having that sort of oh, there is a blind sight to my studying of Japanese religion just become apparent when I was in the airport was really interesting. It made me sort of think more about the actual process itself of being there. And so after all this, basic orientation, we're dropped off at a hotel afterwards, and I decided to go on Google Maps and look up the closest Buddhist temple. And so there was a temple that required like 45 minutes of walking, and it was at night. And I expected, I probably wouldn't be able to go in, but I wanted to at least see one. And I saw one, and it was basically a cemetery, which kind of took me off guard. I don't really associate Buddhism with cemeteries. But yeah, no, there was like this temple. I could hear some monks chanting in it, and there's all these statues of Kshitigarbha around. And Kshitigarbha is like a psychopomp-like character, like sort of the Kshitigarbha basically, lives in hell and has vowed to like free all of the beings in hell, and is also a protector of travelers and women and the marginalized, children. And so Kshitigarbha is very concerned with those who are marginalized. Which it is interesting to note that Buddhism is a religion that would view those in hell as worthy of sympathy and as being marginalized compared to how Western religions like Christianity and Islam tend to view those in hell as sort of they're just desserts, although there's probably exceptions to that and it's complicated. But yeah, if you know about the harrowing of hell, where Jesus goes down to hell to take all those who never had a chance to believe in him out, it's like that, I guess, is sort of like the view with Kshitigarbha. But yeah, it was, and I didn't really go inside of the temple because, well, I didn't think I was allowed in. It seemed like they were in the middle of a ceremony, and I wasn't even sure if I was trespassing just by being as close as I was. And it's interesting because as I was later see more and more, people in Japan seem to associate Buddhism a lot with death. And that's always felt strange to me. I mean, there are certain parts of Buddhism that are very focused on death, but I usually think of Buddhism as like focused on life and living and being. And so, while yes, there are some emphases like the thoughts you have before you die affect your rebirth, or death meditation, where you sort of desensitize yourself to the fear of death by reminding yourself that sickness, old age, and death are inevitable, are definitely parts of the religion. I don't really think of it as a religion about death. And it reminded me of this article I read a long time ago called The Orthodox Heresy of Buddhist Funerals. It kind of talked about how in Japan, Buddhism has just become a death industry, which is kind of ironic because in many ways traditional Buddhist thought teaches that death is something that we shouldn't, focus too much on because it distracts from, like aspects of life and whatnot. But it seems like at the very least in Japan, it's associated with the death industry and reverence for the dead, which is interesting. And I'll get back to this later because this pattern comes up over and over. But afterwards, I found a little Shinto shrine. I don't know what kami it was dedicated towards, but it was interesting because it was like in the middle of the suburban area. And then you see this like big torii gate, and you go through and it just feels like you're in the middle of the wilderness all of a sudden. And again, you're like in the middle of this like neighborhood. And then there's like a shrine. You can like bow to the shrine, give money to it, give food or whatever, and then you go out the torii gate again, and then you're in suburbia. Like the torii gate felt like a dimension to a different world. And that was kind of interesting. And I would experience that again and again, that it seems like these Shinto locations are designed to make you feel like you've entered a completely different space in a way that I've not really experienced before. So about a week or two later, there was a field trip we had to Tokyo, and we went to three locations, two of which are related to this: the Meiji Jingu and Sensoji. So, the Meiji Jingu is a large Shinto shrine that was built after the death of Emperor Meiji, who is the emperor who oversaw the modernization and westernization of Japan in the late 19th century. And it was it had that large torii gate sort of that you know go through and you feel like you're in a different world, but it was quite different. It wasn't like sort of the middle of this wooden like woods, wooden enclosure area, but more this large forest, and it was quite different. Like this long trail where there are trees that were from all over the world. Like apparently, after World War II, when it was destroyed and they had to rebuild it, countries from all over the world like donated trees that were there, and so it was like a very diverse set of trees. It was like very odd, and we you go through that, and then you find this large sort of like enclosure with the shrine that hosts the spirit of Emperor Meiji, and you can write on these little tablets to make wishes and stuff like that. I made a wish about like being able to get into a Japanese grad school, I think, and there were also these like charms you can buy, and this is a reoccurring thing that I would encounter over and over, but that would give you luck or things like that. The one that I actually got from there is right here. This is one to improve your studies that I keep on me in my purse, and yeah, it was kind of interesting. There was also like a lot of sake bottles. I still don't really understand the role of sake in Shinto, but it seems to be a big thing. And after that, we went to Sensoji, which is the oldest Buddhist temple in Tokyo. And I felt very moved by being there, despite how annoyingly touristy it was. It was also destroyed and rebuilt in World War II, but the original one, oldest temple in Tokyo, was built in Nara period, so like 7th century, I think, may have been the 6th century, I don't fully remember. But it was interesting because it very much was like commercial. You have all these people visiting, and like some areas allowed pictures, some it was forbidden. I'm kind of reluctant to share any footage or images I took, though, because people in Japan very much value their privacy, and it's really hard to censor this stuff, especially in the age of AI. And so, and there were definitely areas where you weren't allowed to take pictures at all. Like inside of the main temple building, there were several like Dharma protector like beings that had statues of them. I think there was like one for each of the 12 zodiac, like Chinese zodiac signs. I don't fully remember, but yeah, you weren't allowed to take pictures in there. And yeah, there was also charms, and I actually got more there than any other place because I really want the Buddhist ones. So again, my purse here, I have this one, which is also for studying, and I also grabbed this one, which was for health, and also this. It's a charm for traffic safety, and you just attach it onto the windowsill with this little thing, and yeah, it jingles around when the car moves, especially when the car's more erratic, and it's kind of interesting, because I guess in that sense, it becomes a reminder to be careful if, like, the car slips or things are bumpy and it's jingling more. Although, interestingly, I actually did experience a car crash since getting this. It was a couple months ago, and I was driving past my university, and a college student went past a stop sign trying to get to an exam quickly, and totaled my previous car. Uh, you know, I'm not going to sue Sensoji for a defective charm. I never believed it would work in the first place. Although some part of me feels like it kind of does work. I mean, no one was harmed. The settlement was in my favor, and stuff like that. But I like it a lot. It adds some character to my car, and I don't know. Some part of me does feel like it works, despite knowing full well when I bought it and now that it does not. I also got to experience sort of what inspired fortune cookies, which, by the way, fortune cookies are actually of Japanese origin and are not really a thing in China. And they sort of became associated with Chinese restaurants in the United States due to a weird complication of history. But basically, a lot of Buddhist temples in Japan have these little fortunes where you pay money, you get a piece of paper, it tells good luck, bad luck, different levels, and if you get a really bad luck one, you can do a ritual to basically destroy the bad luck, which I ended up doing because I got bad luck. And in fact, I got like the worst luck possible one. So yeah, and I had to ask someone how that worked because I I think there was a sign explaining it, but I was kind of confused, and someone showed me because not really fluent in Japanese, and so yeah, that was kind of interesting. And yeah, no, I it was also kind of interesting because it's like I'm used to books being the main sort of like merchandise that Buddhist temples sell in the United States at least, and they not a single temple I went to until the last week I was in Japan sold books, and that was kind of interesting. There were like they sold these sort of charms, and a lot of the friends I made in Japan, they had these charms. Like they didn't consider themselves Buddhist either, which was made it really interesting. Like these charms were just these little things that they kept to give them good luck, and I I'm still very confused about the role of how Japanese people interact with religion in Japan because simultaneously I saw that people interact with it a lot, but I'm not really sure how much people believed. I mean, I feel like you have to have some degree of belief to want to go to a temple to pray because you're anxious about an exam. And I saw a lot of people do stuff like that. But it's also like, if I asked people, they said they weren't sure if they believed. But what it really seems like religion serves as a purpose in Japan is a very community focused thing. So tourism, is a big thing that I saw that day. The other thing that I saw my first day in Japan was serving sort of social functions. There's like funerals, weddings, and birth ceremonies, and various other things like that. And also on religious holidays, I hear New Year's and some other days are really big, like Oban, which is kind of like Dia de Muertos, Day of the Dead, and stuff like that. But overall, it reminds me of how a lot of Catholics and Jews interact with their religion, where they go to church or synagogue twice a year. And outside of that, maybe weddings or funerals. And except, yeah, like regular interaction with your religion on a regular basis seems to be a much more Western thing than I'm used to. And because, like, again, I consider, like, Islam to be a Western religion. Its roots are tied to both Judaism and Greek philosophy in the same way that Christianity and, well, Judaism are. And I feel like when you're thinking about religion through that context, it seems like these regular weekly gatherings where you're talking about the philosophy of it, and some preacher is talking about the philosophy of it, feels like what religion is. But it seems like in Japan, that's a thing that happens through syncretization. Like, new religious movements often do that. Like, but, and yeah, in the United States, it's like my Buddhist temple does that, but that's probably more from the influence of, if you're a Christian or Jewish convert to Buddhism, you probably want something that replicates weekly service. And in Japan, it's interesting, but even a lot of priests don't really think much about the philosophy and theology of Buddhism, which was very odd to get used to. Like, even when I, you know, got over that I was too used to Sanskrit terms and tried to learn all these Japanese terms, when I would try to talk to priests, they oftentimes didn't really know much about the stuff I was trying to talk about. And some of it, honestly, probably a lot of it was just because my Japanese level is not very good. But when I came back to the United States and I spoke to a Buddhist priest here, he told me that, oh yeah, no, you can have much more meaningful discussions about Buddhism with a lay person in the United States than you can with the average priest in Japan. Especially because, you know, since the Meiji Ishin, since the 19th century modernization, Buddhism has become sort of nepotistic, where the head of a temple passes down from father to son. And so, as a result, a lot of people, they are Buddhist priests because it is what they are expected to do, because it's what their family does. And, you know, that probably doesn't create the best conditions for sort of like super enthusiastic interest in sort of the theology of it, but I also don't really know if before that lack of knowledge of that was necessarily less common. So I don't really know. But it is interesting to me that I guess what I would think of as superstitions and also like community events and tourism are what Buddhism and also Shintoism seems to mostly be. And I guess I kind of had an idea of that before, but it really started hitting me more. In fact, when I was talking to a friend of mine, she was curious like why I came to Japan, what interested me about Japan, and I explained, what I study. She made a comment that in Japan people don't believe in Buddha anymore; they believe in God. And like, I think she may have been making a statement about how like, and not people. Sorry, she said that Buddhists tend not to believe in Buddha anymore; they believe in God. And I've had some debates in my head over what that meant. Since then, does it mean that Pure Land Buddhism, which sort of emphasizes like a very Christian feeling form of salvation, is sort of what Buddhists are there? It is the most popular form of Buddhism in Japan. Is it that they have ignored the philosophical aspects for supernatural ones? I don't know, but it was kind of interesting. And I guess how secular Japan felt, really started hitting me more and more. Like, one of my friends, I don't, when wanting to bring me to Kamakura with her, said that, that I would like it because I'm really into history. And, she specifically went out of her way to show me the Buddhist areas. And I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking that comment, but I do wonder if it's part of what that just religion in Japan feels like a historical thing to most people. I don't know. At one point, my host mother was reading the newspaper and saw a thing about a local festival that she thought I'd be interested in. And unfortunately, I had something that conflicted with it, but she was able to get me to come to a practice carrying. So here is a poster sort of for it, and it was in Gyotoku, which is sort of like near the border of like Chiba and Tokyo. And basically, if you see this here, It's like this large sort of like portable shrine that people carry together on, and they do these elaborate things where they like, raise the shrine up and pull it down to show like to bring the god both to heaven and earth, and sort of like in the shrine there is a god, and I was scared to like mess up if I joined in the practice, so I didn't. But I was offered to just for fun, even though I, they, because they wanted the public to sort of see what it's like and stuff. But what's interesting is I actually asked, like, hey, what is the god that's, in this shrine? And I was told it's a secret. And that was kind of interesting. Like, you're just not supposed to know. And yeah, it was kind of interesting, and it was like this huge community bonding thing. And the significance, I don't think really mattered again, whether or not you believed. It was just a community bonding event. There were a couple other small festivals I went to that had a similar thing. So like at one point I went to Sawada, which is more in eastern, like rural Chiba, and I have this little pamphlet from there where we carried like on a rope this very large sort of like, it reminds me of those like Macy's sort of like floats, except it was like made from like wood and like painted and stuff. They're really pretty, and you're just like pulling it across this town. It was like really difficult, even with like dozens of people. And it was pretty fun. Locals are very excited that people from abroad came for it, because like people don't usually visit rural Japan, especially for like a religious festival that, like, honestly, even at my university, not many of the students had ever heard of. So it was like pretty insignificant. And most of these small areas have these like events. It was like that have just like been a part of their traditions for a long time, like hundreds of years. And some festivals are more famous than others, but it's like most places have them. Like by my school, we just randomly encountered a festival happening one day that we participated in, and stuff like that. And I will say that was fun. Like these little folk festivals, and it seems like, again, this was like one of those things where religion is more of a social bonding thing that's sort of like rooted in traditions that most people don't really know the history of or really understand. It's just like an activity people do, and oftentimes is an expression of your local area or being Japanese. And in fact, a lot of times when I heard people talk about this, it reminds me of the scene in like Fiddler on the Roof, where he's talking about how their community is built upon sort of the shared traditions, and he talks about how like you're expected to have like a hat on your head and like a prayer shawl on you at all times. And then speaking to the audience, he asks now, he says, I bet you wonder what the origin of these traditions are, and I'll tell you, I don't know. It's like a lot of it very much reminded me of that. It's like these traditions that we don't really think of the origins too much. It's just sort of an expression of the being and community and bonding. And outside of Judaism, I'm not used to thinking of religion in such a way. And it makes sense to me that Shinto works that way. It's an ethno-religion. But I noticed that was happening with Buddhism as well, which, yeah, I tend not to really think of that. Like, even in the United States, where, like, I think Catholicism is oftentimes, like, interconnected with Hispanic identity. I've known people who really didn't like the Catholic Church, but said that they could not leave it because they feel like they'd be betraying their traditions. Even then, it doesn't really feel as close to how Judaism identifies with its traditions as I was seeing in Japan. And that was kind of interesting to me. And, I actually, before I even came to Chiba, I had done some research, and I learned about this place called Noki Kiriyama. So Nokogiriyama is like a mountain that has one of the oldest, like Buddhist temples in the area. It goes back to Nara period, similar to Sensoji, and it had this giant Buddha carved into the mountain at the top, to Dainichi Nyorai, which is sort of like the manifestation of the universe itself, which all existence emanates out of, like the beams of a sun. If you're familiar with Sol Invictus in Roman mythology, it's a similar sort of thing, like the one god that all of existence emanates out of. And so, and you can see like these 8 Buddhas around Dainichi Nyorai that, sort of represented the different like emanations of the primordial Buddha. And it was just very awe-inspiring just how huge that was. And like that's not even the biggest, Buddha that's ever been carved. I think it is the largest one I ever saw when I was in Japan, but like prior to the pre-modern day, like before the Taliban blew it up, the Buddhas of Baiman were, the largest in the world. Like, look up images of them. They are enormous. And it's weird sort of comprehending that people did that by hand. Like nowadays we have like really large like metal statues like in various Buddhas because with industrial technology it's not super hard to do that. It requires less labor than like those ones did, but it's still so awe-inspiring. And yeah, at the temple there was a really interesting thing where you could just buy a little like Jizo doll, write your name on it, and put it in a pile of them, and you could sort of see them like disintegrating over time, and it was kind of weird. I actually like bought one just thinking it was a souvenir, and then realized that I'm supposed to use it in the ceremony, and part of me actually was kind of tempted to just take it anyway, but I'm like, no, I think they expect that we use it for this, ritual, so I did that. I don't fully understand what the point of it was, but yeah, I did that. There was also this like gift from India that was like a sort of copy of one of the pillars of Ashoka, who's sort of like the Indian king that was responsible for like, propagating Buddhism to an extent that he even sent Buddhist missionaries to Greece and Egypt. And yeah, just the Indian government like donated that. And, I also did another thing where I did the, fortune thing. This time I actually got good luck. I couldn't fully understand it, so I showed it to a friend of mine who was Japanese, and she's like, oh yeah, this is good luck. And also, because of that, I got to grab like a charm. So this is an omokiji, which is kind of like a protection charm that I got from that temple. You didn't really know which one you were going to get when you did it, but I got this little frog one, and also this little thing that said that I will make it home safely, and so, something that I was not questioning until, after getting this. And on the way down, I saw all these statues of, headless Buddha statues mixed with these other Buddha statues that had their heads. And from what I was told, the statues many of them were beheaded when the anti-Buddhist persecution happened during the Meiji Ishin. And in years since, a lot of people have, been doing projects to restore them with the heads that they could find, but many hadn't been found. And with that, a transition to one of the more interesting classes relating to religion that I took is relevant. It was politics in contemporary Japanese society. And it's one of those classes that on the surface doesn't seem like it would have much to do with religion, but religion penetrates into every part of life. And when I was looking through the syllabus for all the classes that were offered at the program, it was the one that seemed to have more references to religion than most. There wasn't an explicit, Japanese religion or Japanese folklore class, and so, not only did I look at the syllabi, I also looked into professors. And this professor, his specialization was the Japanese Rite, which had a lot of intersection with religious movements and their influence on politics. So that was also a big part of why I took the class. He seemed relevant to what I was studying, and even if he didn't bring it up much in class, I figured I could talk to him about it, which I did. But he also did bring it up a decent amount in class. One of the major political parties that's very relevant to modern day Japanese politics is Komeito, which was founded by the Soka Gakkai movement. And they came up quite a bit. In fact, his wife, was from a family that practiced the Soka Gakkai religion, and so their relationship with the Komeito party came up quite a bit. And I learned a lot of interesting nuances about how, electoral politics in Japan have a lot of really strict campaign laws that lead to politicians not really being able to campaign effectively outside of, doing some, under the table stuff. And one thing that they do is get strong relationships with religious organizations so that the members will vote for specific politicians. Or in the case of Komeito, it's a party that's pretty much exclusively associated with the members of Soka Gakkai. And he sort of explained how, because it's a movement that has a lot of, housewives, a lot of their policies, benefit these housewives. Like, for instance, strong welfare policies for families, which not only, helps the common, member of the religion, but also it gives them spare income to donate more money to the religion, which is kind of interesting, that this sort of focus on, welfare policies would be associated with, a religious organization like that, because it could make it easier for them to get funds from their members. And also, a lot of the context of how the movement was, persecuted during the Japanese Empire era because, they were pacifist and they took issue with state Shinto, and, how, the members of Soka Gakkai, don't believe in, worshipping any gods or figures outside of their denomination of Nichiren Buddhism. And so, as a result of that, a lot of times they get discriminated against by not participating in civic rituals, which for most Japanese people aren't even thought of as very religious. It's just a thing you do because you're Japanese. So if you go to a field trip where you're visiting, various places, and all the students, go into this, shrine, and, your parents tell you you have to, not go in and then worship those gods, that creates rooms for bullying or discrimination, by your peers. And, yeah, these are things that I never thought about much before. I knew a bit about Komeito, and definitely Soka Gakkai, but a lot of those details were very fresh and interesting to me. And also, a lot of the history around the context of that party was quite interesting. Not only that, but it wasn't for a field trip, but he offered anyone who wanted to visit the Yasukuni Shrine to come along with him. And the Yasukuni Shrine is probably the most controversial religious site in Japan. It honors those who died for the emperor in, wars. And what that has, effectively become is, a kind of glorification of the Japanese Empire in certain ways. But also, after World War II, when Japan had to secularize, it was no longer a government-owned shrine, but was handed off to, the people who were managing it. And without government support, they had to find, different forms of income. And they found that appealing to some of the most nationalistic, pro-Japanese imperialism people gave them more money. So they made, a additional sort of, form of worship that explicitly venerated a lot of people who were executed in the Tokyo War time trials for war crimes. And so explicitly, venerating these war criminals was so controversial that the Emperor of Japan and every prime minister since, with the exception of, Shinzo Abe, have refused to visit the shrine. And but the thing is that despite the controversy that it's given it, that has helped them make more money, as it has shown to a certain demographic of people, that they support their cause. And so that was interesting for a few reasons. One is just the complex political situation of that. But the other was that this presented secularization in a negative light that I never really thought about before. Like, we usually think of, like, separation of church and state as a positive sort of progressive thing. And so the idea that separating church and state in this instance actually led to the, shrine having more autonomy away from, like a government that was moving past imperialism was quite interesting to me. And it was also interesting, too, because we went at a time when there was a lot of extra security because of a group of Chinese, like tourists who, peed on one of the pillars in the shrine and wrote the word toilet on it. And so we also kind of got to see this controversy happen. But what was also really interesting is sort of like, it felt very two-faced. Like, doves were a symbol. It seemed to present itself as like some sort of thing that wanted peace, and, it even had a smaller shrine in the background that honored the victims of those who fought against Japan. And so, like, so that they can say that, they're honoring everyone. When Shinzo Abe, came to the shrine, he didn't just, worship at the main one. He also went to the one that honored those who died fighting Japan. But at the same time, it's a smaller one that's kind of tucked away in the corner. And is it really impressive? It's not what most people are hearing about. And, simultaneously, it's like there was like this one area that had like rocks from all the different colonies of Imperial Japan, like, these little island nations, and which just seemed incredibly, insensitive. And so it was interesting seeing it trying to present itself as more than just something that honors these war criminals, but at the same time, it's like, to me, it just seemed like it was trying to, like, eat its cake and have it. But I don't know, it was kind of interesting, especially because it was one of the most beautiful shrines I went to, one of the most beautiful places I went to in Japan, which made it even more frustrating, sort of the way that they politicize themselves. And granted, being a memorial for the Japanese, like, imperial, like, army's deaths inherently is going to be controversial, but the fact that they, I guess, went even further and explicitly honored war criminals adds like, layer of controversy that just, it seemed unnecessary. And it seemed like a place that could have, like, reconstructed itself into something that was more beautiful and appealed to, like, people in a way that wasn't controversial. But I guess the thing is like, the money is probably a factor here, the money that they can get from nationalists. And, like, I have stuff to reflect on that. I feel like if I keep speaking anymore, I'm going to say wrong things. I probably already have, in all fairness. But it made me sort of think about this stuff in a different way. And in a class the semester before, back in the U.S., we discussed the Yasukuni Shrine for like a week. It may have even been 2 weeks. And still just going there and having this, local politics professor, like, explaining all, the stuff and the controversy, it made me ask new questions. And I'll get back to this later, but I think that the main benefit really wasn't what I learned. It's the new types of questions I found myself asking. Also, there was a day where, for the politics class, we visited the Japanese National Parliament building. And, before I went there, I decided to visit the Ueno Zoo, as, it was nearby, and it seemed like one of the, few chances I'd have to visit that. where I wouldn't really have to go that far out of my way. So when I was there, I noticed something kind of interesting, which is that it was right next to a large Buddhist temple to a goddess named Benzaiten. And Benzaiten was not a figure I had heard about before coming to Japan, and she's apparently based off of Sarvasti, who is sort of like the Hindu goddess of music and learning. And I vaguely knew of her, but you know, I'm not super knowledgeable on Hinduism except in its relation to Buddhism, and Western Buddhism likes to kind of cast aside all that, like, the quote unquote religious trappings and stuff like that, and so like a lot of these figures, who are like gods and goddesses and stuff like that get de-emphasized. And it's kind of interesting because, there it was like this temple that was dedicated to like various misfortunes that you could pray to have them, like not hurt you. Like there was this one monument like dedicated to the fugu that was honoring the fugu and like, trying to pray that it wouldn't like, kill people for revenge. And, another one to like, prevent your glasses from breaking and stuff like that. And so like I saw something that was like described her as like a goddess of misfortune, which I think is more like that she prevents them. But it was also this really interesting figure that I'd never seen before. It was like this little old man inside of a snake, and his name was Ugajin. And Ugajin is... I don't really know much about him because when I actually tried to research him, I mostly found blog posts. I didn't really find much, and I'm gonna have to dig deeper when I have more free time. But like, he seems to be something that like, again, doesn't really get talked much about in the stuff that I'm used to, but seems to be important enough that like, a lot of Japanese people recognize who he is, and they've seen him at temples, and apparently that was a masculine form. There's also a feminine form of Ugajin. And so, yeah, it's, and so, actually being there and encountering these new figures that I can now learn about was actually just, like, really cool. And these are, again, like, this person, despite appearing quite a few places, I saw, this figure several times later, it's like I'm just finding blog posts. And, I could probably go in, deeper and learn more about Ugajin, but yeah, it was a new thing. And speaking of, Benzaiten, in one of my other classes, there was actually someone who did a presentation on the way that, religion has adapted to modernity, and brought up this temple where Benzaiten was basically turned into an anime goddess, and they did like the Buddhist priest there, adapted by, doing, like cosplay stuff. They did like a maid cafe and stuff that was like themed around this, and it was actually weird because in some cases like they even sexualized her, which it was really interesting because like on one hand it's like you're seeing this commercialization of Buddhism in this one context that actually did get more people coming. It increased this temple's popularity by a bit, and it seemed to have worked. And even though it was controversial at first, most of the people in the temple kind of just accepted that, yeah, this is bringing people in. And it's funny because most of the people in the class are kind of uncomfortable with this idea, but I pointed out that Buddhism has a long history of adapting, and there's a concept called skilled means that has led to a lot of stuff. And also sexuality has actually, been something that has been documented to be used to bring people into Buddhism since, like the story of Nanda. And while, the story of Nanda, who he's told that, when you become a Buddha, there are these, like heavenly goddesses that, only are available to those who become Buddhas. He later realizes, through his path that, he became interested for bad reasons, and so then he sort of overcomes that sort of desire. And I compared this a bit to that there are, and outside of story of Nanda, the Lotus Sutra, which is like the most important religious text in Buddhism, also has something kind of similar go on. So it's like this practice of skilled means uh, is willing to do things that seem controversial to bring people in. And this just seemed like a new modern form of that to me. But it was also kind of interesting, um, seeing that, feeling of discomfort that I was seeing in myself, even though I was also, a bit willing to like play devil's advocate with it, like especially like making these like plastic, like figures, that they were selling. And I actually found this in several places. Like, for instance, when I went to Nikko, and I visited, sort of like the shrine that, whatchamacallit, holds sort of like the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate. There's a famous, temple there, or not temple, sorry, shrine, that, has these like three monkeys, sort of like seeing no evil, like hear no evil, say no evil thing. And, actually there was like a gachapon machine, which are there's like these little capsules that you like put some money in, and then it gives you this random plastic toy that you assemble. And I actually got, this out of it. And that was kind of weird to me. But I found later on, a, another temple, a Buddhist temple this time, that did it. And, well, actually, kind of. It was a temple inside of a university, Komazawa University, which is sort of like one of the oldest universities in Japan. It's, like the main university of like my own Buddhist denomination, Sotozen. And they actually had these, gacha machines that had, like Dharmapala, like Dharma protector figures, and I actually got two of them, which was kind of interesting. There's this one here, and also this one. And I will say that, like, despite getting these, the concept of it does make me uncomfortable. Like, it feels very antithetical to a lot of, like, the ideas, of Buddhism, of, to have these very commercialized, like, plastic, like things. But, on the other hand, I found myself wondering what is the difference between those and those charms that I'm getting. Besides that, they kind of appeal to a more modern, culture that likes collecting these, like, like figurines and stuff like that. I don't know. Like, it didn't feel. I don't know why it feels weird to me in comparison, but it does. Um, and but and by the way, going to that university was actually a really interesting experience, especially because it is probably one of the universities that when I try to go to grad school, I'll probably be trying to apply for, because like not only do I think it might be a bit easier to get an in with it because of people I know, and in Japan, as I learned, having a letter of recommendation from someone associated with a university is really important, which I didn't really understand before coming there, and but also the other thing that was kind of like interesting is seeing sort of how like this university had sort of like this temple in it that did these ceremonies that I got to participate in and kind of see how they're a bit different from the US, because most temples in Japan didn't really have many opportunities for lay people, but this one did, and that was kind of neat. And I actually liked it in some ways, like more than in the US, because like I found that the way that their chanting papers worked is they had the kanji, and then they would have like the phonetic guide to how they're pronounced above them called furigana. And in a Buddhist ritual, usually, at least in East Asia, you're supposed to, like the beat of the drum goes one per kanji. And that's really hard to follow when you're reading a romanized version of it, like is typical in temples, here in the West. But seeing it with the kanji made it a lot easier to know like the rhythm I'm supposed to go at, because while in Chinese each kanji is one syllable, in Japanese they sometimes two, and so like fitting that rhythm was a lot easier here, um, and that was kind of neat. And finally, when coming to the sort of skilled means adaptation, and probably surprisingly one of the most meaningful encounters I had with Buddhism my entire time in Japan was an izakaya, which is like a tavern, I guess, is probably the closest equivalent in English. This place that serves alcohol and food, and just sort of like a place that people like, like relax and like meet each other. It was run by Buddhist monks, and it was called Bozu. And they spelled it with the kanji, that's sort of like a slang term meaning baldy, which is like a term for like a monk, basically. It's slightly derogatory, but sometimes reclaimed. And also the English, word for it was vows, which is interesting. It's like a bilingual pun, because also the B and V sound so much as Spanish, or kind of conflated in Japanese as well. And so it's like the vows that monks make. And it was interesting for quite a few reasons. So firstly, almost every time I went to a Buddhist establishment in Japan, it was mostly men. A lot of times in business suits, and I later learned when coming back and talking to someone like here about that, they're like, oh yeah, a lot of times companies will donate money to temples and make all their like salary men like go to a ceremony in honor of it or something like that. But and also the clergy are mostly men. Like a lot of these temples pass from like father to son. But here in this bar, there were actually like some of the barkeeps were actually women, and also most of the clients were women. And it was kind of interesting because like when I went into the bar, there was like this little shirt and like CD being sold for like the first album released by these monks, and it seemed like they were very much like doing what they could to sort of like make Buddhism feel appealing to people. And it's kind of interesting because if you're ever like reading about Buddhist ethics, one of the first things you'll encounter is a Panchashila, which is sort of like the five sort of habits that you're supposed to have as a Buddhist, and the fifth one is to not consume intoxicants which cloud the mind. And this was a bar that served alcohol that could get you drunk, and it was very playful. Like they have this amazing drink called Mugen Jigoku, which literally means never-ending hell, and is and and it was like a really interesting drink using black vodka and stuff like that. But anyway, it was like there was a really interesting playfulness with everything. Um, and it was kind of nice to talk to the barkeeps. They saw that I was like wearing Buddhist stuff, and we tried to talk. It was kind of difficult because my grammar is not really that great for discussing a lot of the concepts involved in Buddhism, but I tried my best. I also brought a friend of mine with me who was actually kind of hesitant because this was a vegetarian establishment, and this friend wasn't really into vegetarian food that much. And while this establishment felt kind of weird in relation to the fifth precept, or habit or whatever, the Panchashila, saying, not to, like consume drugs, the first one is not to take life, which involves animals. And so everything was vegetarian. And the vegetarian food was really good. Like, my friend actually loved sort of the tofu eel that they had, and actually described this as, and this friend went to izakayas all the time for fun while visiting Japan, said that this was like the best izakaya that they had went to. And yeah, it was kind of interesting. I bought one of the albums. I had a miscommunication when I was trying to say to split the bill into two. They thought I was asking for that we each wanted one of the CDs, and so I had to like explain like, oh no, I wanted the CD. We just want two separate bills, and the other languages, learning them is hard, but it was kind of interesting. Like there was a little Dharma sermon given that kind of ended with the monk saying and keep on drinking and stuff, and like I don't know, that playfulness felt very genuine. In fact, I went there a few times, and one of them, I met this woman from Vietnam who uh, talked about missing how like widespread Buddhism was in Vietnam compared to Japan, where it's kind of died out, and she liked this bar because she had sort of that space for it. And we talked a bit. It was kind of interesting, like seeing that perspective, and you know it seemed to create a meaningful Buddhist space for a lot of people in a way that it felt like Japan didn't have many of. And it's funny because like I was thinking to myself how like a place like this would feel so weird if it was run by like Christian priests, but actually one of the study abroad students I went to there with actually told me that they would probably be more interested in Christianity if there was something like this for them. And so yeah, and this sort of skilled means thing, like I find interesting that like yeah, on one hand it is sort of like uncomfortably violating this prohibition on alcohol that Buddhism has, although it's not as strict as with like Islam or something like that. Um, in fact, in modern day Japan, especially, a lot of monks will drink alcohol as long as it's not inside of the temple, and even that is wishy-washy. But it's still traditionally you're not supposed to, and laity, really they don't really have as strong of restrictions as monks, but it's still strange. But on the other hand, showing off how good vegan food can be is something that they were doing, and like I could totally see, just from a skilled means perspective, being like, yeah, we can play around with this one precept for one that we think matters more. And yeah, that was interesting. I went back a few times. It was nice. Met different people, and yeah, a lot of them, very much were enjoying sort of this space where they can interact with like Buddhism in a way that felt a bit like more meaningful. Than just simply like sightseeing and getting to participate in these rituals on a bar with their friends or things like that. It was, I don't know, it just, I feel like when I explain this to people, they usually think of it slightly negatively at first, but I actually feel like compared to some of the other things I saw, like selling these plastic figurines, or like stuff like that, this felt more authentically Buddhist to me. And when you're thinking in terms of like religious studies, you really shouldn't be thinking of authenticity, but it is difficult for me to separate my own sort of like faith from my study as a scholar at times, and so like some of this is sort of my own personal perspective, and I am questioning what I need to unlearn when I'm trying to think objectively about some of these things, like the gachapon stuff, like you know and actually being in a context where I'm actually seeing it in person and sort of interacting with that struggle between like what I study secularly and what I personally believe is probably really important. And there's also one other thing before I'm going to move on to Christianity, which is that when I was in Nikko, I also visited a place called Edo Wonderland. And, my host family thought it was really funny that when they brought me to Nikko, that was the place I wanted to visit most, when it was known mostly for its religious sites. But the idea of this Renaissance fair style theme park dedicated to, like pre-modern Japan seemed really cool. And, the place that interested me the most was a sort of exhibition that showed you what a Buddhist hell looked like. And hell in Buddhism is not like infinite. It's sort of like you're reborn there, and then it's kind of like purgatory in Catholicism. You eventually get out, but it might take a while depending on your sins. But it was interesting going through sort of like what felt like a haunted house, just showing all these elements of torture and stuff like that. And then you get to the end, and you see sort of like this Buddha that's leading you out of hell, and like sort of showing that like even in this horrible suffering of hell there is a path out was really interesting. And I actually like I've heard of stuff like this in Thailand, but seeing it in Japan was actually kind of cool. um, I don't know how common these types of like hell themed haunted houses are in Japan, but it was kind of fun. I didn't see that much proselytizing when I was in Japan. The subway station by my house occasionally would have Jehovah's Witnesses with a little stand just waiting for people to approach them. They don't really knock on people's doors anymore like, stereotypically they used to. And, that seems to also be the case in Japan. And for the most part, I only really had two interactions with people proselytizing. The first time was, and it was actually weird because both times happened on the same day. In fact, like only 10 minutes apart from each other. So I was visiting a friend, and her mom was, preparing a dinner for us, and and so like yeah, I went to the train station. I was there a bit early because I overshot, and so I was like waiting around for my friend to come and pick me up and bring me to her house, and I got approached by two Latter-day Saint missionaries, and I'll get to this later, but they asked if I wanted to come to their church. I told them that I'm in the middle of finals, so I'm pretty busy right now, but I'm going to be in Osaka before I go back to the U.S., and if they knew the location of one, just tell me about that. And they did. We added each other online, and I eventually went to the one in Osaka. But like 10 minutes after they left, these two women approached me, and they spoke entirely in Japanese very quickly, and I don't know why they approached me compared to others, especially because it seems like their religion was very nationalistic. Because unlike a lot of people that I had interacted with, they didn't really seem to be good at like dumbing down their Japanese to my level. Um, but what I could make out is that they were talking about Mount Fuji and how they had a really important temple there, how Japan was going to be destroyed by the Chinese and North Koreans, and all this other stuff like that. I was able to make out that it was some sort of Buddhist denomination, probably tied to Nichiren, and it was kind of difficult. My friend arrives, notices that I'm interacting with them, and basically is trying to tell them that like, oh, her mom has like made this big dinner for me, and like the for this thing, and like we didn't want to keep her waiting. And they're like, oh no, your mom can wait type thing. It was like very like trying to hold us there. So anyway, I was just like, hey, can you just like give me one of your papers? And so they gave me this, which, yeah, reading it confirms they were a Nichiren sect. Their main temple's on Mount Fuji. They bring up how Nichiren predicted the Mongol invasion, and how the emperor needs to proclaim their denomination called I think it was Tenshokai, or yeah, sorry, Kenshokai. It's Kenshokai, and so yeah, like basically has to make sure that the religion is adopted by Japan, and that'll save it from catastrophe and all this other stuff. And I was kind of confused why such a nationalistic religion like this would be trying to convert someone like me, who is clearly not Japanese. And it seems like part of it is just like, I mean, one, a lot of times like people who come to a country often like that country more than the people who are from there. It's a common feature culture of immigrants, and also a lot of immigrants tend to be very disaffected and lost in life. So, it actually makes sense as a type of person you try to recruit, especially when, it's not like I'm Chinese or, Korean, where I think a lot of their nationalistic sort of antagonism is directed towards. So, maybe that was part of it. But it was kind of interesting because I'd heard a lot of people talk about how aggressive proselytizers are in Japan. And yeah, I'd never seen that aggressive a proselytization in my life. I've interacted with, Latter-day Saint, also known as Mormon missionaries, a lot in my life. I visited their churches several times in different places I've lived, stuff like that. And they've never really felt very aggressive, you know. And so it was interesting seeing this, and I definitely saw why a lot of people in Japan might be hesitant about, like, new religious movements, like even getting out of the way the violence that was, committed by Aum Shinrikyo when they did a sarin gas attack on the subway back in 1995. It's like just the converting tactics seem pretty aggressive, and yeah, like even like Soka Gakkai, which has stopped that type of thing from what I've heard, and they don't really focus on converting people anymore, still have a negative sort of perception of having used to having done that in the past. Which, admittedly, even Jehovah's Witnesses today, they don't knock on people's doors anymore, but people still remember when they did. So I mean, fair enough. But yeah, I'd like to move on to discussing Christianity in Japan now, because that was something very interesting. Because, like, when people say Japanese religion, they're not going to think of Christianity. But indeed, there's a lot of unique aspects to, religion in Japan. For instance, early on I actually encountered this sort of magazine that is run by the Makuya Bible Seminary. And they're a denomination which, is unique to Japan. They're actually, like, not super exclusionist. They kind of do a lot of cooperation with, like, Buddhist and Shinto groups, and, they also are interesting because they have some Judaizing tendencies, meaning that they adopt a lot of practices from Judaism, and also they don't use the cross as a symbol, they use the menorah, because the cross they, recognize is an execution symbol and is kind of morbid, and so they use the temple menorah as sort of their symbol instead, which is kind of interesting to me. And at one point I visited a Presbyterian church, and it was quite different than church experiences I've had in the U.S. because it was all elderly women. There were no families. There was like only a few men besides the priest. And while in the U.S. I would say that, like, it is usually women who are the majority of religious services, it's usually not this extreme. There's usually families and stuff like that, but it was like there was one family there, like, in the entire, congregation. And it was actually kind of neat that I could, understand a decent amount of the sermon, because a lot of it seemed to be talking points that I've heard in English a decent amount, like talking about, like, the 4 Greek words for love and stuff like that. It was also kind of interesting because he was talking about the Puritans and, their experiences, like, settling down in America, and comparing that to, like, Christians in Japan. What was also, I guess, interesting about what I noticed was that compared to any other institution I had been at, there was much more excitement about, Westerners being there. I did experience it when I went to that festival in Sawada, but it makes sense that, like, a religion imported from the West, would have that sort of excitement of Westerners coming in. It's probably a bit like how oftentimes I think in Buddhist institutions in the West, there is sort of that excitement when an East Asian Buddhist, comes in. And I didn't have that many introductions to Christianity, but when I did, it did feel like there was a lot more open-mindedness and inclusiveness in those communities that reminded me of, Buddhist communities in the West. In fact, when I went to the Latter-day Saint Church in Osaka, I had a similar experience, except it was a bit easier to communicate because a decent number of people there also knew English. In fact, when I first went there, the head of that specific church, when finding out that I was a religious studies major, told me to sit next to his wife. And it was interesting because, like, she was very into reading about various world religions. She actually was really excited to find out that I was, like, a religious studies student. And, she actually expressed something that I had already kind of noticed, which is similarities between, like, Judaism and Shinto. And we kind of talked a bit about that. She talked about the tomb of Jesus Christ that's found in Tohoku, which that's its whole weird thing of sort of like this claim that, Jesus, didn't actually die on the cross. It was his brother, and Jesus fled to Japan. And it was funny because, like, the comparison between that and a traditional Gnostic belief came up, and she surprisingly, like, knew a decent amount about, like, early Christian diversity and all this other stuff. She recommended that I visit the Ise shrine and one of the major shrines of Shinto, which I didn't know about before coming into Japan. And since coming back, I've done some more research, and it really is a shame that I didn't visit it. But it's one of those things where oftentimes being there, you end up realizing what seems relevant to people there rather than the scholars I'm hearing about in the West, where I feel like a lot of times the discussion of Shinto is more centered around pre-war politics and also, like, Miyazaki films half the time. And so, like, I'm actually surprised that I hadn't really known much about the Ise Shrine. I probably would have if, like, Shinto was my main focus, but it just wasn't. But in any case, like, yeah, that open-mindedness. Everyone at the Latter-day Saint Church actually, like, knew I was a Buddhist and thought that was interesting. That, oh, hey, you're coming to a Christian, church because you study religion, even though you're Buddhist. And in Japan, I noticed that a lot of times, people kind of were confused by the idea of me being raised a Buddhist in, the United States. I would sometimes explain the context of how, like, the counterculture movement, in, like, the 60s was often really attracted to it and stuff, and sometimes they kind of get it. But, explaining to Japanese Christians, it made sense to them. They come from a religion that, engages in a decent amount of proselytization, and, most of them are either converts or children of converts, and so, it's just, it was the other way around for them. And, yeah, they reminded me very much of that sort of, like, open-minded, sort of, like, inclusive, and rational side that I associate with Western Buddhism. And it's made me a bit more interested in studying the psychology of, like, converts as well as like children of converts, because I can't imagine that it's like Christianity has some essence that mixes with some Japanese essence that just makes it so that Japanese Christians function a bit like Western Buddhists, especially when I felt like Buddhists in Japan, had less in common with Western Buddhists than Western Buddhists had with Japanese Christians. I feel like, if anything, it signifies something about, the psychology of converts. Another thing that was really interesting is that one of the first times that I went to a bookstore in Japan, it was called a Bargain Bazaar. What was the other name? Book Off. It was called Book Off, yeah. Bargain Bazaar Book Off is like one of the big chains there. And also I went to several other, places, like looking for, a Bible, I knew the words that you would need to find one, seisho, I know the kanji in it. I could find the religion sections in places, and I found, like, manga Bibles and books of Bible stories, but finding an actual Bible took me, like, 6 stores to go to. Now, granted, in, Japan, Christianity is a small percentage of the population, so it might be comparable to trying to find like a Quran in an American bookstore, but I would have found a Quran by then. And when I did finally find one, it was like at this really large bookstore in like downtown Tokyo. I can't remember exactly which area it was, but there was one, and yeah, that was odd to me. And it's not like there was a plethora of like books on like Buddhist sutras or things like that. I think it's more like I think that maybe it's possible that a lot of Christians in Japan are similar to Buddhists in America, where they're more interested in books about the religion than reading the sacred scripture. I mean, in the West, there's this long tradition of like people reading the Bible regularly, and the sort of like being a part of a school that has like a catechism that sort of explains doctrine that you're supposed to memorize and stuff like that. And in Japan, I don't get the impression that like sutra study was ever a major part of the religion, and so I feel like similar to how most of the time when you meet Western Buddhists, they don't really read many of the sutras and holy texts besides like the ones that you chant during ceremonies. It's always these books about Buddhism, and like if you go to like a local bookstore like where I am, you might find a Tibetan Book of the Dead, and that's like most you'll find. Usually you won't find that. You'll find like these books by Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama or various figures like that that are sort of explaining Buddhism. And I feel like that's what I was saying with Christianity in Japan. And like I did find a few interesting things. Like I got a manga that was explaining Zen that was really cool, and it was actually kind of cute because there's these things called Daruma dolls, which I think of them. Actually, I have one here. You like paint one eye in when you make a wish, and the other one when it's fulfilled. And they're based off of the founder of Zen Buddhism, Bodhidharma, and it's sort of like a cutification, I guess, of a religious founding figure, which is kind of interesting. And so they actually have this guy sort of explaining it in this book, and it's very much like sort of has like the story about these like stressed workers, and has all these sort of like infographics in different places. Like for instance here, and I also found a book explaining like the 13 denominations of Buddhism in Japan, which I never really thought much about like numbering like 13 denominations of Buddhism, but apparently that is a metric. It was actually mentioned at the Buddhist bar that there were like 13, and it comes up in this book a lot. The 13 schools to understand the well books. Translating Japanese literally feels weird. The book that helps you understand the 13 sects of Buddhism, I guess is what it's literally called. And yeah, it was also like this book on like religious history. But yeah, the religion sections in bookstores were typically pretty small, and the stuff that existed was very much these like secondary materials to help people get into stuff, never really the scriptures themselves. And it was actually kind of a shame because until I actually like found that one place, I never really got to see what the Bible looked like in Japanese. And actually I thought that Ecclesiastes, reading that in Japanese, was actually kind of beautiful compared to like what I had typically seen. I really liked how it was handled in that translation. But yeah, these sections were typically pretty small, and the primary sort of religious text didn't seem to be much of a focus outside of churches themselves. Another one too. It's like I got at the LDS church, I got this Book of Mormon, and which they gave me for free. And there was also this book called Come and Follow Me, which is kind of cool. It's like this sort of, I think it's like a instruction help textbook thing. Like the Latter-day Saint Church, if you know much about them, has a lot of materials like this. And they're like, yeah, if you want to keep that, go ahead. And but yeah, no, I'm definitely sort of wanting to better understand the psychology of converts in general because of how it seemed like people who make religious conversions probably seem to share traits regardless of which directions they're going. And that's not something I'd really ever wanted to study much. And it's probably something, too, that compared to a lot of other things I could focus on studying, probably has a higher likelihood of getting grants. So I'm definitely glad that this has become an area that's opened up for me. And I guess now is a good time more than any to like focus on sort of the conclusions of this annoyingly long video that I'm probably gonna have to edit down a bit. But I can't remember who said it. I know this is a saying that I see associated a lot with the Islamic tradition. Maybe it was Muhammad. Maybe it was some like early Islamic scholar. But it was when I tried looking it up, I've gotten conflicting, answers on this. But half of learning is asking the right questions, and I feel like more than anything, coming to Japan, it wasn't like those new sort of like bits of information like, oh hey, there's this like cool snake god, or like Savasti is like a more important figure than I would have assumed in East Asian Buddhism, or things like that. I feel like more than anything, besides the benefits of like, I now have a clearer idea of expectations in graduate school or how to get to a graduate school in Japan. I feel like what really is happening is that I'm asking different questions. I'm starting to reevaluate the way that I'm thinking about approaching, Japanese Buddhism. And, now that I'm becoming more interested in, like, what is the psychology of converts, and what makes converts similar regardless of which directions they're going, I never really thought about that much before. I sometimes have thought about, like proselytizing tactics of new religious movements, but the actual psychology of the type of people who make religious conversions hasn't really been something I've thought much about. And I don't think I really would have understood that well. I mean, like, I did a few semesters ago become friends with a Chinese immigrant to the United States who was a convert to Christianity, and it was interesting because he seemed to be much more knowledgeable on Christianity than most people. He really disliked how ignorant most Americans were on Christianity, and various frustrations like that. And he had honestly converted like a year or two earlier, and so the fact that he acquired that much knowledge with that obsession as a convert, it was pretty intriguing to me. And I kind of noticed when I went to Japan a similar degree of frustration, where I'm like seeing that Buddhism has sort of become this like thing that's very clearly in the peripheries of the culture. You can even see in the language and the words that people use, but it's not really something that people care about. Even a lot of the priests, they're just continuing a family tradition and not much more. And thinking a lot more about this push and pull between the way that converts to Christianity are perceiving Christianity, and how when it's in sort of the cultural background and identity of the United States, that's different. I'm seeing that now with Buddhism in new ways, and so thinking about what draws people to religions, and even what type of mindset leads to someone questioning their own and seeking out new things, is becoming a bigger deal for me. And even though I'm not a convert myself, my parents were, and the way that my parents think about the world has influenced how I do. So in a way, even if I don't consider myself a convert, I think that even being a second generation convert to religion affects my mindset. Like, I'm probably a lot more likely to have become a religious studies like student, due to the fact that I come from a convert family rather than generations of it. And that similarly, I think, puts me in a similar boat to that Chinese Christian convert that I met in one of my religious studies classes, who was And yeah, that's just interesting. I'm thinking more about how Japanese campaign laws influence how religions function in the country, and the way that moral panics sort of influence the way that people think about religion. I was actually recently like doing a bit of research on like the Waco siege, and found that I was making connections between similarities and differences between how moral panics and religious identity is understood in a Japanese context. I've had a better understanding of the assassination of Shinzo Abe by someone whose mother and his own life was ruined by the Unification Church, which was financially supported by Abe, because I now get why it was so crucial for the Liberal Democratic Party to be providing support to the Unification Party, and how that electoral system affects that, and so even ideas like the separation of church and state are I'm starting to reevaluate like what that means in a context where the government pulling out of the Yakushuni Shrine actually made it more right wing and nationalistic, and I'm and I don't even have resolutions to all these things I'm thinking about, but it's leading me to exploring new questions. I'm finding that the type of research that I'm doing in my spare time is different than what it was before, and that's incredibly valuable. And I would not be doing that if it weren't for having, you know, studied in Japan for a few months. And yeah, even though they didn't have classes that offered anything explicitly about religion, I had to dig through the syllabi to even figure out what teachers will be good for this stuff. And even though most people I talked to claimed not to be religious, and even if there were certain superstitions that they seemed to be engaging in, or rituals that they were engaging in, and stuff like that, and for a while I just felt frustrated. I felt like I'm not getting anything out of this. The reality is that those frustrations were adding to sort of a more dynamic understanding of what was going on there. It was sort of pulling me out of this like armchair understanding of this, where my only interactions with Japanese religion were in an import temple that was founded by an immigrant from Japan, and you know, and so I definitely heavily recommend that as an undergrad, studying abroad is much easier. If you study abroad in graduate school, you're just thrown there on your own, and like uh, as an undergrad, there's these like curated things like Tokyo IES that I was in that can kind of help you like learn the various basics. Early on there was this orientation by police officers explaining how law is different in Japan and stuff like that. That was helpful, and all this other stuff. And as my East Asian Studies professor said, you know, he regrets that before studying abroad in Japan that he didn't do an undergraduate program there. And since a lot of religious studies scholars probably will be having to do things abroad at some point in the future, it's probably much better to do this type of thing when it's easier and more accessible. So, yeah, I heavily recommend it. And also, as a reminder, the two scholarships, the Gilman International Scholarship and the Freeman Asia Scholarship, I am providing links on how to apply for them. They were very good. They were very helpful. I probably couldn't have even done my trip without the thousands of dollars I got from them. And I'm sorry this video was a bit of a mess. It is my first YouTube video. And maybe one day I'll remake this when I have more thoughts. But I hope at least this gives you ideas. And I think even if you go to a country that isn't studying your main interest, you can learn a lot about diversity of religion and stuff like that. And that's valuable. Like, the fact that going to Japan has made me rethink Christian and American religion was not something I was prepared for. And that's beautiful. But thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry this has been a long video, and bye.